I was at Tim Hortons this morning, and I wanted to say, instead of happy, so I want to say Happy Resurrection Day. But that's probably not going to go too well with the girl who's serving me here, so I'll just go with Happy Easter. But we know what that means. Today is an amazing day to celebrate Christ's resurrection. We've been doing this series called Amazing Grace here over the last 6 weeks, and just want to kind of bring us, hopefully, to the same point as we enter in here this morning. When we hear the word Amazing Grace, probably many of us think of that traditional hymn called Amazing Grace. I'm always curious because to me, that's a song that some people really love and some people, well, they don't really love so much. So just for some fun, no one's recording this. Well, they are, but we're not going to show it to anybody, don't worry. But just for a little bit of fun here, show of hands, how many people really love that old traditional hymn, Amazing Grace? Like it just does amazing things in you and for you. That's great. And we're family here today. We're friends. It's all good. It's a safe place. How many here, just really that song doesn't work for you anymore for a few different reasons? Yeah, and then if you put the bagpipes in, it gets worse for you. Yeah, yeah. For me, it just depends on the day, to be honest. But so here's some things that we've learned along the way. Just three things real quick around this idea of amazing grace over the last 6 weeks. We've discovered, again, that it's a gift. That grace is something that God gives to us. That it isn't something that we have to earn or even achieve, but simply receive. Would you say that word receive with me on three? 1, 2, 3. Receive. That's huge. It's a gift that God gives to us. One of the second things was it's easier to convey or show than it is to explain or define. And you'll catch that as we go along here and we look at grace for today on Resurrection Day, on Easter Sunday. It's almost hard to define because it's so awe-provoking, but it's easier to show, say, there it is. When you see it, when you feel it, you know it. The third is that it's all over the place. Grace is all over the place. I mean, Jesus saw it everywhere as he read through the Gospels. It's amazing. In this Easter story, there is grace all over the place. And as you start to become more aware of God's grace in our life, it's amazing. It is there almost every breath when we're aware of it. Grace really is all over the place. So we're going to head into the Easter story here. But before we do that this morning, because this is a story that is the whole story. It's core to our faith. It's core to the Christian faith. I would also argue that it's even core to the human existence when you get to the depths of what this story is all about. So let me just step back for just a moment in a nutshell, as best that we can this morning, just to hear the whole story of where Easter fits in, Easter Sunday, Resurrection Day. And then we're just going to explore a few ways that we experience God's grace today, in our life today. Try to make this relevant for what's going on in each of our lives. So when we hear the story of Jesus, here's sort of how it goes. God chose to come. God took on human flesh. There's a big word often used for that called incarnation. Really means God took on human flesh. Do you remember when we celebrate that? We celebrate that on Christmas. That God was born into humanity. God took on human flesh. God chose to do that. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh. In the Message translation, I love it, and moved into the neighborhood. God moved into the neighborhood, took on human flesh, God in humanity. And then there's this whole life part of Jesus. Jesus lived on this earth for 33 years. And really, it was the last 3 that we generally hear a whole lot about. So sometimes we wonder about our life and we feel like we're wasting time or we're waiting for something really significant to happen. Well, Jesus was only here for 33 years, and 30 of those were preparing in some ways for what the last 3 would be. That was when we read all these stories about his healing, his radical and transformational teaching, his incredible feeding of the hungry, all those miracles, all those stories that took place. Those are in the last 3 years of his life. But then here's where it went, as you know. Jesus, some were attracted to him and were following him, but not everyone. You see, because Jesus came representing a different kingdom. There was something called the Roman Empire that was proposing a very different way of life, and Jesus came, and in many ways he challenged that. He was a king, as we sang earlier, but he was a different kind of king. And he represented a different kind of kingdom, a kingdom that would have no end, a kingdom that wasn't about power and control and authority, but a kingdom, catch this, a kingdom that was about love and sacrifice and servanthood. A kingdom that would and continues to transform the world one life at a time. But not everyone caught that kingdom, and so between the Roman Empire and the religious authorities, there was a clash with Jesus. He was captured and tortured, mocked and ridiculed, and crucified on a cross. That's Good Friday. Died and was buried. And then here in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 7, we see what happened next. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Friends, almost everyone who hears about this story, who sees Jesus after his death, there is fear and trembling because they were in awe of what had happened. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear this, but this was unexpected. That's grace right there. Unexpected grace. But the truth is that they did expect something to happen at the end of time, but that resurrection would happen at the end of time. And here it's happening now, right here, right now. That was what was shocking to them. And so there's this idea of unexpected grace for them today. I love the way N.T. Wright puts it in this quote. N.T. Wright is a Christian scholar, and if I can understand a tenth of what N.T. writes, then I feel like I'm doing really, really well. And so, you may not catch everything in this quote, but there's this power in what he's talking about that I think is core to the story and core to our topic for today, grace for today. That resurrection isn't just what happens when we die, but resurrection is something that happens in our life today. It was both in the first encounter of this. That death had been defeated. Is that a good thing that we celebrate today? That is a good thing. That is an amazing thing. We celebrate this promise of eternity. Death has been defeated, conquered for once and for all. But it's not just then there's good news for when we die, there's good news for today. That's what this quote is trying to say, I think. Resurrection doesn't mean going to heaven when you die. It's more than that. It is certainly not about keeping the commands of a distant deity. Rather, it is the new way of being human. The Jesus-shaped way of being human. The cross and resurrection way of life. The Spirit-led pathway. It is the way which anticipates in the present the full, rich, glad human existence, which will one day be ours when God makes all things new, a new creation today. It is about practicing in the present, I love this, the tunes we shall sing in God's new world. And would everyone say, today, today, today? That's what's happening here today. So resurrection means that God gives us grace today. Let's just explore that for a few moments here. Where does that show up in our life? Grace for today means simply enjoying this gift of life that God has blessed us with. That would just be a great place to start with this conversation. Because life can get serious and complex. And am I describing your life too, or is that just my life? Do you know what I mean? And all of a sudden it's like, part of this message is God gives us life. We're to enjoy life. And so here's a picture that I just wanted to share with you. Some of you know, is there a picture of a mountain before that? That is awesome. Yeah. Okay, yeah. How do those two work together? It's all about enjoying life. So my youngest son, Caleb, and I, our youngest son, he's not just mine. My apologies to my wife, Katrina, here in the front row. But we were out in Alberta back a couple weeks ago, and we got to go skiing for a day at Mount Norquay in Banff. And the next day we were just reflecting on this, like the beauty of the mountains. And the word that we came up with, the best we could do was majesty. The majesty of the mountains, and we kind of agreed that we had seen a glimpse of the glory of God in those mountains. You know, and that's a piece of just enjoying God's creation, the life that God gives to us. The next slide, again, just on this enjoying life scene. This is a picture. The next one is a picture of the West Edmonton Mall, the water park there, and it'll come. But there it is. And anyway, it's all about enjoying life, and so we. I don't know how far back to go in this story. So. For those that know me, you know that free, you just can't beat free. So Caleb and I had this day plan to go to the mall, to this water park, and so the way the day started was my sister-in-law gave me a 2-for-1 coupon for the water park, which I was just starting to enjoy this day even more already. You know what I mean? And then we get there, and we find out that there is free pop and juice all the time at the West Edmonton Water Park. They got these Coca-Cola machines, and you can just go and drink as much as you want all day long. And for us, that was just a very simple way to enjoy that day and life. So it is about enjoying life. Grace for Today, simply enjoy the little things. You'll have your own. Those are mine. Sometimes Grace for Today means going through hard times. Because as much as we can sit here today and it's Resurrection Day, it's Celebration Day, and that's great, the truth is, still, we live in a reality where life is hard, do we not? And so sometimes grace for today is that God would give us strength to simply get through this day, or to get through whatever it is that we're facing in our life, or whatever our world is facing this day. There was just an amazing man who I was so privileged to know. His name was Jim Kane. And Jim got real sick, and whenever I go to see Jim, it was clear that to be honest, every time I seemed to go, he was getting more and more sick. But every time I walked through the door, I would say, "Hey, Jim, how you doing?" And Jim would say, "I'm getting better." And the truth was, at least physically, he wasn't getting better. But God was doing something in him spiritually where he really believed that he was getting better. And that was the attitude, the strength that God was giving him. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you." Christ's grace is sufficient for us. "For my power, Christ's power, will be made perfect in our weakness." Grace for today sometimes means getting through, with God's help and power, hard times. Grace for today means sometimes being easy on ourselves. So often, we're so hard on ourselves, aren't we? And grace for today means that God enables us to receive forgiveness and not be so hard on ourselves all the time. There's this beautiful passage of Scripture just before what I would call the beginning of the end for Jesus, just before the road to the cross. In Mark chapter 14, there's this woman who takes a jar of perfume, and she breaks open this jar, and she pours it on Jesus as a way of blessing him, and everyone's really harsh with her. And how could you do this? And that money could have been used for other things. And Jesus says, "Leave her alone. What she's done for me will be remembered." And then he says this incredible phrase in Mark 14:8. He says, "She did what she could." Sometimes grace for today is recognizing that God enables us to stop beating ourselves up, that God would encourage us and say, "You did what you could," and that's good. It's grace for today. Grace for today is sometimes to work hard. Anybody in here like to work hard? First Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul talks about what we're talking about here today, resurrection. In fact, the chapter is 58 verses, and he spends 57 verses saying how resurrection is core to our faith and who we are. And then verse 58, he ends it like this. He says, all of that means that what we do today really matters. So sometimes grace for today is simply taking what is our life today and joining God, partnering with God, participating with God in what God is doing in the world, and making a difference. And when we work at that, Even when we love to work hard at that, that's actually, there's grace within that. That's part of God's grace for our life. In fact, next Sunday, we're going to follow up on this conversation here this morning. It's called Amazing Grace Part 2. Because the promise of resurrection life is that God would give us life today, but that also Jesus' life would be in us to enable us to do the work in the world that he calls us to do. And so if you are at a point in your life where you're wondering what is next, struggling with what is next, or even how to take that next step to find the courage to do that, we're going to enter a series called Qualified, Equipped, and Empowered, and that's part of this amazing grace of God's life in us as we move into what is to come next for us. Let me just close with this story. This is a story that Philip Yancey tells at the end of his book called What's So Amazing About Grace. This is a scene that takes place in a documentary film that was telling the story of the hymn, Amazing Grace. There's an amazing story behind that hymn, written by a guy named John Newton, who had at one point been working for the slave trade and had a transformational experience where he actually then reversed and fought against it. And that's part of that song and part of the story in that song. But this scene that he's talking about, Philip Yancey, it takes place in Wembley Stadium in London, England. And it's gathered a celebration after all the changes that took place in South Africa. Again, that song's really powerful when you think about the changes that took place in South Africa. They've gathered all of the leading rock bands from around the world, and there's this 70,000 raucous fans in Wembley Stadium, and for some reason the promoters scheduled an opera singer, Jessye Norman, as the closing act. No one was more surprised about that than Jessye herself. So the film goes back and forth, interviewing Jessye on the power of Amazing Grace, showing these raucous fans, having a great time with Guns N' Roses and band after band. Finally, it comes time for Jessye to come out and take the stage. And as she does, it's gone, you can imagine, from big lights and big show and big production to this one simple light following her out to the middle of the stage, this majestic African-American woman wearing this beautiful African dress. As she strolls onto stage, there's no band, no instruments, just Jessye. The crowd starts to stir, a little bit restless. Few recognize this opera diva, and a voice out in the crowd yells for more Guns N' Roses. Others start to take up this cry, and the scene is starting to get a little bit ugly, to be honest. Alone, a cappella, she begins to sing very slowly. Amazing grace. I wish I could sing this for you. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. A remarkable thing started to happen. Several thousand raucous fans started to fall silent before her aura of grace. By the time Jessye reached the second verse, 'twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. The soprano has the crowd in her hands. By the time she reaches the third verse, 'tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Several thousand fans are singing along, digging far back into the nearly lost memories for words they had heard so long ago. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Jessye claimed afterwards that she didn't know where the power descended from on Wembley Stadium that night. But we know, for we live in a world, friends, that thirsts for grace. And when grace descends, the world falls silent. God at work. Jesus alive. Resurrection reality. Grace for today.